Could MicroStrategy become the most valuable company in the world? I think it's possible, and in this video, I'm going to tell you why. Before I do get into it, please make sure to like the video and also subscribe to the YouTube. Really appreciate your support. I'm also going to put a QR code down below for a Bitcoin tip, so if you want to support the channel, feel free to leave me a little tip. Now let's get into it. It is no secret that MicroStrategy, or as they're now called, Strategy, holds a ton of Bitcoin. They've been aggressively stacking Bitcoin for the past 5 years. As of the latest data I've seen, they have 506,137 Bitcoin, which is a ton. They have way more Bitcoin than any other company. Aside from Strategy, the companies with the highest Bitcoin holdings are Marathon Digital with 46,374 Bitcoin, Riot Platforms with 18,692 Bitcoin, and then Tesla with 11,509 Bitcoin. So as you can see from these numbers, Strategy has way more Bitcoin than any other company. They have 506,000 Bitcoin, and they have 2.4% of the entire Bitcoin supply, which is pretty remarkable. And we know that Michael Saylor and Strategy have gone on this mission to acquire as much Bitcoin as possible. They're constantly issuing new debt, this convertible debt, which is very attractive to investors, and they're using that debt to acquire a ton of Bitcoin. If we go ahead and take a look at a visual here, this chart shows their Bitcoin holdings throughout the past 5 years and how much they've grown. As you can see, they've really ramped up their Bitcoin buying over the past couple of years. And if you look at this chart, you can see that they went from 252,000 Bitcoin in Q3 of 2024 to 447,000 Bitcoin in Q4 of 2024. So just in that one quarter, they added almost 200,000 Bitcoin to their Bitcoin holdings. And this just shows how serious they are about this strategy. Now, Strategy also has another side to the business. They sell business intelligence software. This is more like a side hustle for them. They're not bringing in a ton of profit from this arm of the business, and they're mostly using this profit that they get to pay off their smaller expenses or service this debt that they have, although the interest on their debt is pretty low due to the fact that it is convertible debt and it has that value proposition for these debt investors, the fact that they can convert it to equity at a future point in time. But if we look at the numbers for this arm of the business, in the 2024 fiscal year, it brought in $463.5 million in revenue. Now, that was 7% year over year growth, but still not a ton of revenue. When we look at Strategy, the business really is stacking Bitcoin. They have become the Bitcoin treasury company at a price of $85,000 per Bitcoin. Strategy's Bitcoin stack is worth just over $43 billion. And if we look at their market cap, it's currently $75.95 billion. So if we look at the relationship of their market cap to the amount of Bitcoin they have, it might seem like they are a little bit overpriced when we look at the price of their shares. People see that Strategy is going to continue to borrow money and buy Bitcoin, and that they've kind of created this Bitcoin stacking machine, and people want to be invested in that machine. So we have seen a ton of demand for Strategy over the past couple of years, and at times Strategy has even been more volatile than Bitcoin, which is pretty impressive because we know that Bitcoin gets very volatile. We also know that a lot of people want exposure to Bitcoin, but they don't really know what Bitcoin is. They aren't sure how to use Bitcoin. They don't want to deal with the Bitcoin directly. So they see this publicly traded company that is all in on Bitcoin, and they think, hey, I'll get exposure to this asset through this company. Now, Strategy's market cap is only $75.95 billion. So how could this company become the most valuable company in the world by market cap. When we look at some of these giants out there like Apple, NVIDIA, Microsoft, these companies have a market cap of around $3 trillion, so way more than Strategy's market cap. What Strategy realizes is that we are going through a transition and that we are probably going to be transitioning to a new monetary system. And I, like Strategy, believe that it's very likely that Bitcoin is going to be the base layer of this new monetary system. And I believe that Bitcoin is going to appreciate a lot over the next coming decades here as the world goes through this transition. So, in order for us to find out how valuable Strategy can be and their Bitcoin stack can be, I think we need to look at what the total addressable market for Bitcoin is. How big could Bitcoin get? And how much Bitcoin could Strategy acquire? If we look at this visual, it shows the total global asset value for the world. And according to this visual, it's around $900 trillion. Now, I believe this is a little bit understated here. I think that the total global asset value is probably closer to $1 quadrillion, but it's somewhere in that 900 trillion to 1 quadrillion range. And this visual was created by Jesse Myers, one of my favorite people in the Bitcoin space. So shout out to him for putting this together. But as you can see, this shows some of the different global assets. We have equities around $115 trillion, probably a little bit higher in reality. We could also see real estate is a big chunk of the world's value, bonds and debt, gold, money makes up a good chunk of the world's value. So as we can see, there is a ton of value out there that Bitcoin could potentially eat up. And I think we should go through some of these different categories and find out how much Bitcoin could realistically eat into these different asset classes. I think we should start off with money because I think that Bitcoin is going to eat into this money chunk of the world's value a lot. Looking at another visual here, this shows the value of global money, and I got this visual from River, one of my favorite Bitcoin companies, so shout out to them. As you can see, Bitcoin is currently only 1.3% of total global money out there. And when we look at this fiat chunk of money, it's around $108.2 trillion. I think that Bitcoin is going to significantly eat into this value because I think that fiat currencies are outdated and I think they're going to zero. So really, I think that Bitcoin has a chance of eating 100% of this value. I think for the sake of this example, trying to calculate a reasonable total addressable market for Bitcoin, let's say that Bitcoin can eat 75% of this fiat money out there. Well, that would be $81 trillion that Bitcoin could gain from eating into that fiat money. Then we look at hard money. We know that there's Bitcoin around a $1.7 trillion market cap right now, but then there's gold, which is the most valuable asset in the world currently. Gold is currently over a $20 trillion market cap. But I think that Bitcoin could significantly eat into gold because Bitcoin is harder money. It has better monetary properties. And when we look at why people buy gold, why people hold gold, they hold it for its monetary value. But if there is a superior store of value asset out there like Bitcoin, then that is going to steal a lot of demand from gold. So I think we could see Bitcoin eat about half of gold's value, and that would be about $10 trillion. So if we take that 81 trillion that Bitcoin could eat from fiat, and then we add that to the 10 trillion that Bitcoin could eat from gold, and then we look at Bitcoin as it is at a $1.7 trillion market cap. I think that when we look at the global value of money, Bitcoin could eat $93 trillion worth of this market if we're just looking at a good estimate. Now let's look at global debt because the global debt market is huge. It's around $323 trillion. And when we look at government debt, this makes up around $100 trillion of this global debt market. And when we think about government debt, what is government debt? Government bonds are basically a claim on future dollars or future fiat currencies. And like I said, I think fiat currencies are going to zero. If we said that Bitcoin could eat 75% of fiat money, then I think it makes sense that Bitcoin could also eat 75% of government debt. So, looking at the $100 trillion worth of government debt, let's say Bitcoin could eat $75 trillion worth of this market. Now, if we look at the remaining debt, which is business and household debt, this is valued at around $223 trillion. Now, I think it's a little bit difficult to estimate how much Bitcoin could eat into this market, but let's just say, for the sake of this example, let's have a conservative estimate and say that Bitcoin eats 10% of this remaining debt. That would be around $22 trillion. If we add those up, that's $97 trillion worth of value that Bitcoin could steal from the global debt market. And I just want to reiterate that these are just estimates that I've thought about. If you have a different estimate or you disagree, please let me know down in the comments, because we want to get the most accurate number for Bitcoin's total addressable market. Now, if we shift over to real estate, the global real estate market is around $400 trillion worth of value. And I think that this one is a little bit difficult to measure, but that was the number that I got to in my research. And let's say that Bitcoin can eat 15% of this market, which I think is reasonable. When we think about owning Bitcoin, it's a lot easier than owning real estate, right? It's a lot easier to deal with. Bitcoin's been outperforming real estate, and I've heard a lot of people in the Bitcoin space who are invested in real estate talk about how they're selling their real estate to buy more Bitcoin. And I think that we're going to see a lot of real estate investors do this. So I think that 15% may be a little bit conservative, but let's say that Bitcoin eats 15% of the global real estate market. That would be around $60 trillion that we could add to Bitcoin's total addressable market. If we look at global equities, this market is around $120 trillion. And let's say that Bitcoin eats 15% of this as well. That would be $18 trillion that we could add to Bitcoin's total addressable market. I think a lot of people have been storing their value in the stock market, hedging against that dollar debasement, in large part because the stock market is very accessible. Anyone can invest in the stock market pretty quickly. Stocks are easy to buy and sell. They're pretty liquid. So anyone can download Robinhood and invest in stocks. And I think that we've seen a lot of people flee into this market over the past decade or so. But as people realize that Bitcoin is a better store of value, I definitely think we're going to see people shifting out of stocks a bit and into Bitcoin. So I think Bitcoin eating 15% of this market is very reasonable and may even be conservative. The last asset category we're going to include is cars, collectibles, and fine art. And just from looking at that visual we were looking at earlier of the total global asset value in the world, it looks like the market for these assets is around $24 trillion. Let's say that Bitcoin eats around 5% of that. So we'll add another trillion to Bitcoin's total addressable market. Now, if we add up the total value that Bitcoin could steal from all these different asset classes, my rough estimate is that Bitcoin's total addressable market could be $269 trillion. And that could be conservative. Like I said, with some of these different assets, Bitcoin could definitely eat more, but I think that's a fair estimate for the TAM, the total addressable market for Bitcoin. If Bitcoin reached a market cap of $269 trillion, that would put the Bitcoin price at $12,809,524. If we look at Strategy's current Bitcoin holdings at this Bitcoin price, that would put the value of Strategy's Bitcoin holdings at $6.48 trillion. And that would make Strategy the most valuable company in the world by market cap. Looking at the companies with the highest market cap today, there's Apple at 3.36 trillion, Microsoft at 2.91 trillion, and NVIDIA at 2.75 trillion. So just by buying and holding Bitcoin, Strategy could potentially topple these giants, which is pretty remarkable. Like I said, if Bitcoin got to that total addressable market of $269 trillion, Strategy's Bitcoin holdings would be worth $6.48 trillion. And this doesn't even take into account the fact that Strategy is probably going to buy a lot more Bitcoin. Let's say Strategy were able to acquire 750,000 Bitcoin. That would put their Bitcoin stack at a value of $9.61 trillion. Let's say they were able to acquire 1,000,000 Bitcoin. At that total addressable market, that would put the value of their Bitcoin stack at $12.81 trillion. So I doubt that Strategy is going to be able to acquire 1,000,000 Bitcoin. Who knows? They may be able to. Like we saw in that first chart I showed, they've acquired a ton over the past year or so. The thing is, the more Bitcoin they acquire and the more Bitcoin other companies and other entities acquire, the higher the price is going to go. And I think it's going to become a lot more expensive to buy Bitcoin pretty soon here. So we will see how much Bitcoin Strategy can acquire, but they are sure doing a good job of being the leader in this space, especially when it comes to companies. They have way more Bitcoin than any other company. And when I look at some of these giants like Apple, Microsoft, NVIDIA, I think that these companies are really messing up by not having any exposure to Bitcoin. These companies can make a small purchase and hedge against Bitcoin success rather than waiting on the sidelines. I mean, what if Bitcoin were to shoot up to $500,000 this year and these companies don't have any exposure? If we look at the cash on hand for some of these top players, Apple has $54 billion in cash, Microsoft has $71.55 billion, and NVIDIA has $43.21 billion. If they took just $10 billion right now and bought Bitcoin with that rather than letting it sit in cash, they could acquire 117,647 Bitcoin at a price of $85,000 per Bitcoin. So they don't even have to acquire that much. Obviously, the more Bitcoin, the better, but I'm surprised some of these top companies haven't dipped their toe into Bitcoin or done it publicly, because this could really end up screwing them if Bitcoin does become this new monetary system and you don't have any exposure and you're overexposed to bonds and the dollar. Might not be good for these companies. Now, I want to be clear. I am not saying that Strategy is going to become the most valuable company in the world. I'm just saying that it's possible, which is pretty remarkable considering that they don't really produce anything. They're just borrowing money and buying Bitcoin. And the more Bitcoin they acquire, the higher the likelihood that they could become the top dog, the most valuable company in the world by market cap. That's going to wrap it up for this video. If you didn't like and subscribe, please make sure to do that now. Thanks for watching. I'll be back soon.